50 years ago today, the gales of November came early and brought about America's most famous and one of its most mysterious shipwrecks. What exactly sealed the fates of 29 men on November 10th, 1975 has never been conclusively determined, and a variety of causes have been debated among the maritime experts for decades. And to give you a sense of how famous this thing is, I went to public school in New England, and I had a multi-week unit learning about the Edmund Fitzgerald for some reason. Today we're going to be going over the famous wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, looking a bit at the history of the ship and shipping on the Great Lakes, the night of the wreck, the discussion of what caused the ship to go down, and of course, how it ended up in a Gordon Lightfoot song. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and let's just get right into the video. I'm also going to be linking a bunch of YouTube videos that I found really helpful in researching this, so go and check those out as well. For centuries, the Great Lakes have been a key shipping artery for North America. Like everything in America, it played a key role in native societies who settled along the coasts for food and ease of transport. The first Europeans to sail the lakes were the French, who had cultivated a web of partnerships with natives of the region for fur trading. The French are believed to have built the first large ship to grace the lakes, Le Griffon, and its 1679 maiden voyage took it from Niagara Falls to what is now Green Bay, Wisconsin. The ship sunk somewhere on its return journey, and its final resting place has never been confirmed, starting a long tradition of shipwreck mysteries on the Great Lakes. As more settlement came to the region, so too did the sailing traffic. The Great Lakes were a theater of the 1812 war between the US and British Canada, and by the early 1800s the region had become more peaceful. Both Canada and the US witnessed a flow of immigration westward, and the lakes served as an artery of movement. Man-made infrastructure linked the lakes into the wider North American transit system, with the 1824 Welland Canal bypassing Niagara Falls, the Erie Canal the next year connecting Lake Erie to the Hudson and New York City and Atlantic Ocean, and the 1848 Illinois-Michigan Canal, which connected Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. As people flowed west, increased industry emerged as well. Grain from America's breadbasket flowed east, and minerals from American and Canadian mines fed the industrial hearts of the region in Ontario and the American Rust Belt. The introduction of steam-powered vessels only accelerated this, and the proximity to minerals, food, and transport laid the foundations for some of the largest cities in the Lakes region, including Buffalo, Thunder Bay, Cleveland, Toronto, Milwaukee, Detroit, and of course, Chicago. Enter the SS Edmund Fitzgerald. Built in 1958, it was the largest ship on the lakes at the time of its creation, coming in at 728 feet long, even longer than Lake Superior's average depth. The Fitz was commissioned by Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, and the ship was named for that company's CEO. It was then leased to the Obel Bay Norton mineral firm for 25 years. While many different types of cargo traversed the Great Lakes, the Edmund Fitzgerald primarily hauled taconite, a sort of unprocessed iron ore that would be transferred to steel mills for purifying into usable metal. Due to its large size and plethora of hauling records, as well as efforts by its first captain, Bert Lambert, the Fitz was famous in the region, maybe akin to something like the Goodyear blimp. It played music, and Lambert even shouted fun facts to onlookers on the shore. But as time went on, the boat, and before people get mad at me, they do call them boats in the Great Lakes, even though yes, they are technically ships, the boat may have begun to have some structural issues. This was pretty common, and repairs were frequently made for all freighters, but in particular, some anecdotal eyewitness statements of crew members and dock workers seem to hint that there may have been some issues with the Fitz's keel, or the bottom part of the ship, in 1975. The degree to which this was addressed, if at all, isn't clear, and the captain of the ship at the time, Ernest McSorley, allegedly was dismissive of it. The ship would be put up for the winter for repairs anyway, and McSorley was planning on retiring pretty soon there. However, this may have been a fateful attitude, as the captain and crew of the Edmund Fitzgerald prepared for another haul on November 9th, 1975. moving a large load, 26,535 tons of taconite from Superior, Wisconsin to the Zug Island steel mill just outside of Detroit. On average, it took the Fitz about 5 days to make this journey, and for the first leg of the trip, it was going just fine, but bad weather was settling in. National weather reports noted a large storm was forming starting down in Oklahoma, but the initial predictions saw the storm moving through the Midwest and south of Lake Superior. The Fitz left port at 2:15 p.m. and steamed east across Lake Superior. Despite her record-setting size, the Fitz was also quite fast and overtook other ships on the same route through the lake. Other ships, notably, were concerned about the weather and chose to hug the northern coast of the lake to avoid the worst of the storm, while the Fitz, alongside other ships, opted for the more conventional southern route through the middle of the lake. By 7 p.m. that night, the more cautious captains were vindicated as a warning went out for the whole lake to be ready for bad weather. The Fitz, alongside another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, heeded the new warning and moved northeast towards the Ontario shore, hoping to mitigate the weather as much as they could. Through the night, they encountered 60-mile-an-hour winds, 10-foot waves, and snowy weather. McSorley slowed the Fitz, a call that shocked other captains who heard the radio traffic, since he had a reputation for braving storms and moving his cargo quickly. The brunt of the storm passed over the Fitz and Anderson, and as they went through the eye, they had some brief reprieve before the weather picked back up. Now, winds were blowing not from the east, but from the northwest, giving the wind and water more time to pick up momentum than they had earlier in the night. While we don't have an exact record of the Edmund Fitzgerald's path, the crew of the Arthur M. Anderson noted that the Fitz continued on its path near an area called the 6 Fathom Shoal. The Anderson steered eastward away from it for fear of scraping against the bottom, and the lack of correction by the Fitz had caused some to wonder if the shoal could have contributed to its fate. Not long after, around 2:45 p.m., the Fitz passed into a snow squall, and visual between the two ships was severed for the last time. Less than an hour later, Captain McSorley and the Fitzgerald radioed the Anderson.
Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have sustained some topside damage. I have a fence rail laid down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish?
Charlie, on that Fitzgerald, do you have your pumps going?
Yep, both of them.
On the surface, this seems like minor damage, and the crew of the Anderson thought the same thing. Topside damage could have been indicative of maybe debris like a log or a large wave impacting the deck of the ship in the storm. Alternatively, it could have also been caused by some deformation of the ship. Despite being massive and made of steel, freighter ships, including the Fitz, were designed to be able to flex, which allowed them to bend rather than simply break in half when there was serious conditions. The railing in particular could have been a symptom of something called hogging, where the center of the ship flexed up, stretching parts of the deck until it caused some damage, i.e. the railing. The fact that the pumps were running and that there was a list or tilting of the ship to one side also indicates that the Fitz was taking on some water, although again, how much water is something that no one really knew at the time. According to the 1977 U.S. Coast Guard report, quote, "The flooding which could be expected from the loss of any 2 tank or tunnel vents would not be serious enough by itself to cause the loss of the vessel." Further, the Fitz had 4 pumps, so if they were only using 2, assuming we are interpreting McSorley correctly here, it may indicate that they didn't think the problem was so serious. At around 4:10 p.m. on November 10th, the Fitz radioed the Anderson again that its radar systems were out and asked the Anderson to help them navigate. By this point, the waves were reported as high as 18 feet and the winds as high as 67 miles an hour. Over an hour later, sometime between 5:30 and 6 p.m., the Fitz got in touch with another ship, the Avafors, which was miles ahead near Whitefish Bay, an area that, if the Fitz had reached, would probably have given them some shelter from the storm.
Hey, nobody on deck.
What's that, Fitzgerald? Unclear, over.
I have a bad list, lost both radars, and am taking heavy seas over the deck, one of the worst seas I've ever been in.
If I'm correct, you have 2 radars?
They're both gone.
In this conversation, the crew reported a more dire update from the Edmund Fitzgerald. Not having people on deck in those conditions would of course not been a surprise, but by this point, the list seems to have gotten worse, and McSorley explicitly talks about how much water is flowing over the top of the ship. When waves crash over the deck of a ship, it isn't inherently always a problem. After a few seconds or minutes, the water can drain off, and as long as everything is fastened, not too much water will leak into the ship and weigh it down. But if lots of water were leaking into the ship, then it would over time weigh it down and make it sink lower and lower, losing buoyancy. Also keep in mind that while the ship was over 700 feet long, the crew wasn't like hanging out in the center area of the ship. This area was filled with the ore, and since the hatches to the body were supposed to be secure, no one was going around checking the body of the ship to see how much water they were taking on. Things remained this way for a couple more hours. By this point, the Fitz was about 10 miles ahead of the Anderson, and they still couldn't see each other, although the Anderson could tell where the Fitz was on radar, but it was spotty. The weather was only getting worse, and a couple of large waves from the north, between 25 and 35 feet, hit the Anderson at about 7 p.m. and continued south. At 7:10 p.m., the two ships would have their last contact, discussing a boat coming towards them a few miles away.
Fitzgerald, this is the Anderson. Have you checked down?
Yes, we have.
Fitzgerald, we are about 10 miles behind you and gaining at 1.5 miles an hour. Fitzgerald, there is a target 19 miles ahead of us, so the target would be 9 miles ahead of you.
Well, am I gonna clear?
Yeah, he's gonna pass to the west of you.
Well, fine then.
By the way, Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problem?
Yup, we're holding our own.
Okay, fine. Well, I'll be talking to you later then.
5 minutes later, the Edmund Fitzgerald entered a squall, which made it disappear from the radar, which is normal. But after a few minutes, they weren't showing up for the Anderson. And just then, the visibility cleared, and the crew of the Anderson started watching the nighttime horizon for the lights of the Fitzgerald, but there were none. Captain Cooper had his men adjust the radar, and 3 ships came into focus, but they soon realized that none of them were the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Anderson contacted the Coast Guard and kept trying to radio the Fitz, but to no success. A search wasn't launched for another hour and a half due to bad conditions and a lack of available ships, and the Coast Guard asked the Anderson to participate in the search. The next morning, as the storm eased, they found some wreckage, including a lifeboat that, according to the damage on it, had never actually been launched, as well as part of a boiler and other minor debris. By now, everyone knew that the Fitz, along with her 29 men, were gone. In the subsequent days, scans of the seafloor found the ship's final resting place, but it wasn't until the next year that a dive on the wreck equipped with a camera confirmed that it was the Fitz. The ship had split in half, and no bodies were found, although they would later find one decades later. The bow of the ship was upright on the lake bed, while the stern was upside down and at a slight angle a little bit further away. There was a large impact site on the lake bed right in front of where the stern hit the bottom, and taconite pellets were spewed around the area, implying that the ship probably nosedived into the lake bed and then split in half. Amazingly, since the wreck happened 50 years ago, no other freighters have been lost on the Great Lakes. And to put that in perspective, in the previous century or so, 30,000 men had died on the lake. So, what exactly happened? Definitively, we only have a handful of facts. Over the hours prior to the sinking, McSorley reported the ship was taking on some water, had a broken railing, missing some vent covers, and there was a list. That list presumably got worse later, and it was low enough to have water consistently rushing over the deck, and both pumps were running. And we have the forensics at the bottom of the lake where we can see that the ship is split in half. Unsurprisingly, there was an investigation into the matter soon after, and there's actually a few of them, but we're only going to be looking at the first big one today, by the US Coast Guard, which I mentioned earlier. And here's what the official findings in 1977 were. For one, they noted that McSorley's decision to slow down prior to the sinking may have indicated that he believed the damage was actually worse than he was letting on. The Fitz also neglected to put out its weather report earlier in the day, which may also imply some significant distraction on the ship. Going faster would have gotten him out of the storm faster, of course, but going fast could also have accelerated any problems they had, and they would have had more splashing and water going overboard, which could have made everything worse. Presumably, the damage was dire enough that a couple more hours of higher speed may have sunk or severely damaged them, in McSorley's opinion. It also notes in Section 2 of the conclusion that the quote-unquote proximate cause of the sinking cannot be determined due to a lack of good evidence. But in Section 3, they do give it their best guess. Quote, "The most probable cause of the sinking of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was the loss of buoyancy and stability, which resulted from massive flooding of the cargo hold. The flooding of the cargo hold took place through ineffective hatch closures as boarding seas rolled along the spar deck. The flooding increased as the vessel lost effective freeboard, finally resulting in such a loss of buoyancy and stability that the vessel plunged into the heavy seas." Section 4 then goes out to lay out a list of contributing factors to that, including the freeboard or height of the deck above the water allowed by this time legally was less than what the ship had initially been built for. The hatches on the cargo holds weren't always properly maintained over time and thus didn't work or weren't used. The question of if the clamps were used is brought up again, but a lack of damage to them seems to indicate that they were not in use. The cargo hold had no sensor system to warn the crew if it had high water levels, and the cargo hold didn't have bulkheads, so water could spread through the whole hold once it got in. Section 5 muses on the cause of the topside damage and says that while no conclusive answer is to be had, it is most likely that a log or other floating object hit the ship, causing more damage to the ship than McSorley believed, and with low visibility they weren't able to avoid the object or tell how much damage it may have done. It also rules out the likelihood of scraping on the shoal due to the likely course of the ship avoiding that area. Section 6 postulates that damage to the ship was towards the front, causing the ship to trim down or nose down, which in turn caused more leakage of water towards the front, dropping the trim even more. A similar, albeit much slower dynamic ended up sinking the Titanic, which I made a video about here. This all eventually would have probably caused the ship to just nosedive, impact the lake bed, and then split in half, and a lot of the ship would actually still be on the surface because the ship was longer than the lake was deep. There are in all 20 sections, which I'm not going to go into all of them here, but I will link the report here in the description. That being said, the last point essentially says that no one is at fault for the sinking, including the inspectors and the Coast Guard. But this story was all met with backlash. For one, many saw it as blaming the sailors for their own fate. Given the crew's experience, many also found it unlikely that they could make such a rookie mistake, especially when they knew bad weather was coming. Unsurprisingly, alternative theories started to spring up right away, although keep in mind that most of these are not mutually exclusive, and the wreck was likely the result of multiple factors. When looking at why the Fitz sank, there are 5 main culprits that people point to. The factors here are, as we've already seen with the report, 1 is crew or clamp error, 2 is a large object strike, 3 is scraping on the lake bed, 4 is pre-existing damage, and 5 is rogue waves. We've already looked at 1 and 2 in the official report, but there's also a great video on YouTube, which I'll link in the description, by Alexis Dahl, where she interviews an expert on the case, and he brings up a couple of other important points. For one, he says that even if all the clamps had been done properly, the seas were rough enough and the freeboard low enough that they wouldn't fully work. Since they were only rated for 4 feet of water, and of course water is heavy, so once you have more than 4 feet of water above it, you might have some structural failures. On this journey, the deck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, or its freeboard, was only 11.5 feet above the waterline, and adding 4 feet to that, the ship could be safe against 15.5-foot waves. But as we've seen earlier, the waves were regularly reported that day in excess of 18 feet, especially as it was getting into the evening. As such, the crew didn't have to do anything wrong for the ship to go down. It's also worth noting that another thing mentioned in this YouTube video, that I'll have in the description as well, is that since the hatch covers were so heavy, it would often be common practice to not use the clamps at all because the weight of the covers was just sufficient to make it not move. Next is a theory that I really subscribed to for a long time, which is that the Edmund Fitzgerald scraped along the 6-fathom shoal, which caused damage to the hull and caused the ship to eventually sink. The main proponent of this theory was Bernie Cooper, the captain of the Arthur M. Anderson that night, who publicly stated that he believed the Fitz scraped the lake bed in the shallow waters around Caribou Island. However, as that Alexis Dahl video reveals, in the actual sworn testimony he gave, Cooper did concede that the ship didn't hit the shoal after being shown evidence of its trail by the investigators. This evidence was twofold. The attempt to triangulate the Fitz's position showed it would have easily cleared the shoal's location, and later dives on the shoal showed that there was no red paint or damage to the shoal, which could be consistent with getting hit. Further, the impact of running aground, as mentioned in these videos, is very, very noticeable and unlikely to have gone unnoticed by the crew or captain. Plus, damage sustained from running aground is usually very visible and pretty catastrophic, so the ship likely would have sunk way sooner and there would have been a big gash in the hull, which just is not present when we look at the wreck. That being said, another shoal was discovered not far off of the 6-fathom shoal, which could have coincided with where the Fitz did end up going, thus making Cooper potentially right that they could have gone over a shoal, even if, again, maybe they didn't hit it. Next is a pretty straightforward, kind of boring theory. The Fitz wasn't quite up to snuff structurally, and some pre-existing issue led to flooding and eventual sinking. This would most likely be an issue with the keel, which was reported to possibly have issues, as we talked about earlier in the video, but again, there's just not a lot of evidence for or against this one. Then we have the coolest theory, rogue waves. Rogue waves are a type of wave usually coming in groups of 2 or 3 that are at least twice the size of the waves around them. These are different from tsunamis, which form from a serious disturbance in the water like an earthquake, and while they're usually smaller than tsunamis, they are also very unpredictable. The exact way that this happens is kind of complicated, but suffice to say that very large waves, in addition to pre-existing damage, could have finally sunk the Fitz. And sure enough, as we mentioned earlier, the Arthur M. Anderson reported being hit by 2 waves between 25 and 35 feet tall, which continued on in the direction of the Edmund Fitzgerald and would have reached to the area of the ship at around the time it went down. In this scenario, the first wave would have flooded the ship, weighing it down even more than it already was, and the second one would have finished the job, tilting the ship and sending its bow deep underwater before finally snapping the ship in half. In my personal opinion, I think a mix of factors 1, a little bit of 2, and 5 make the most sense for why the ship sank, in addition obviously to the bad weather just generally, right? Like if it was a perfectly nice day, it wasn't gonna sink. Factor 4, pre-existing damage, is also possible, but there's just not that much evidence for or against it, as we've talked about. And since 2005, dives on the site are actually banned since the ship is considered a graveyard by the Canadian government, whose waters the ship sunk in. It seems to me that the rough seas were too much for the Fitz, and maybe all the hatches weren't fully fastened because they initially thought the weather would be fine, and then they only got partway through fastening the hatches, which takes many hours, before the weather got too bad and they had to give up on that. My only question with the idea we talked about earlier, where the clamps just weren't enough even if they were used, is why didn't that affect other ships too? Like, they were all in the same sea. I'm not an expert, so if anyone has information, I'd love to hear it in the comments. But surely the Fitz wasn't too distinct in its freeboard compared to other ships on the lake at the time. But hey, maybe the Fitz was the only one with that low of a board that was in a bad storm for that long. Nonetheless, the theory makes a lot more sense to me if you also include something like a foreign object causing a little bit more damage, and then the 2 rogue waves at the very end, which probably sealed the deal. And of course, we have to answer the last pressing question: how did this wreck get into a song and get so famous that a 3rd grade New England teacher makes her students learn about it for weeks? Well, as we mentioned earlier, the Edmund Fitzgerald was a local celebrity, so the fact that it went down with all hands on deck at the peak of its fame was particularly jarring for the region. Keep in mind, a lot of safety regulations and practices changed when this happened, and since then, there have not been any freighter wrecks on the Great Lakes, and it's been 50 years. It was publicized in many magazines, which inspired Ontarian songwriter Gordon Lightfoot to release a song about it the next year. And the song is so famous that I have been playing it on guitar for this whole video. So hope you've been enjoying that and it doesn't sound too horrible. Interestingly, Gordon has actually changed the lyrics of the song a couple times, since some of his original lyrics were seen as insensitive. For example, the original version alluded to the hatches being improperly fastened, which the families of the victims took offense to, and then he changed it to be more ambiguous. He also called a church that honors the sailors a musty old hall, which he later ended up changing as well. That same church, the Mariners Church in Detroit, annually holds a ceremony where it rings a bell for the victims of the Edmund Fitzgerald. It rings 29 times for the men who died, as well as 1 time for all shipwreck victims, and, starting a couple of years ago, 1 more time for Gordon Lightfoot himself, who passed away in 2023. The bell of the Fitz is also now on display in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Paradise, Michigan, after it was lifted from the ship in 1995. The bell on the lake bed was replaced by a replica with the men's names written into it, forever serving as the collective headstone for the brave men that their families lost 50 years ago today. So that's it for this video, everyone. Thank you for watching. Sorry if my voice sounds really hoarse, but thank you for watching. Have a great day. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. And have a good day. Goodbye.